Hey, this is Ashley Davis from HeliTuning.com, and today we're building the MicroHeli Vortex 200 Pro. And this is a model that, if you've watched the overview video that I've produced, or the what's in the box, there's another word you might use to describe that video, you'll know that this helicopter comes as a number of pre-built parts, and there isn't a huge amount of build work to do in order to put the helicopter together. However, as with all pre-builds, you have to be very careful that the pre-built components are in fact built correctly, so we need to check with the manual to make sure that whoever built this in the factory has actually built it correctly and everything is in the right place. But additionally, as with all model helicopters, we need to use Loctite on any screw that's going into a metal thread. Go over the helicopter a screw at a time and uninstall each screw, make sure there's some thread lock on it, and then put the screw back in. So I have here the rotor head, and this is where the manual starts off in terms of building the Vortex 200 Pro. And with this you'll find that there is a little rod that goes through here where the flybar would normally be, which just keeps this flybar cage in place, and that will need to be removed as one of our first steps for us to put the actual flybar in there. Also, when you're going through and checking all these various screws for Loctite, you need to take out the feathering spindle bolts and just make sure that everything in there is as it should be, that there is grease on the bearings and some silicone grease on the dampers to make sure there's no stickiness in the head. And something else to check is that all the links are moving freely, and if not, you may want to do some work on those links just to free them up with a ball link reamer or something like that, just so that you've got nice smooth movement on all the linkages and nothing is sticking, because on a 200 size helicopter the servos aren't that powerful, and if any of these links are sticky then it can lead to jerky movement of the head, and the helicopter just won't feel very smooth to fly, and it'll feel very pitchy and up and downy, for want of a better word, and it won't want to settle in a hover nicely. So that's something you need to bear in mind as part of the checking all the screws and freeing up the links, etc. So given that that is built and that I've already gone through this and checked all the screws and applied Loctite where it needs to be applied, the next thing for us to do is to undo the grub screws here on the top of our flybar cage, take this retaining rod out, and then we can go to bag 2 in the kit, which contains a flybar rod, which I have here, and our paddles. And the first thing we're going to do is insert our flybar rod, get equal amounts of it sticking out each side of the flybar cage, and then install the paddles onto it. And that effectively completes the rotor head ready for installation into the machine. So that's where we're beginning our build. Okay, so I've removed the retaining rod and inserted the actual flybar, and the next job for us is to make sure that the distance from here to the end of the flybar rod is equal on either side of the cage. So this distance here needs to be the same as this distance here, and you want to use a vernier scale to measure that accurately down to, you know, a few thousandths of an inch or half of a millimetre, and get that absolutely perfect before we contemplate trying to put the paddles on there. Once you've got that the correct distance, you can Loctite these grub screws and tighten them up to hold that flybar in place. Okay, so that's mine done and Loctited in place, and for reference, the distance on mine from the edge of the flybar cage here to the end of the flybar rod was 54 millimeters each side. So now we can get our paddles and screw those onto the flybar rod, and again we need to screw them on the same distance so that we end up with an equal gap between the cage and the edge of the paddle. Okay, and there we have both paddles installed, and I installed mine so that the little bit of writing that's on these is on the top of the paddle, and once you've got them on there you need to sight down them and line them up so that they're in line with the flybar cage, so the paddle is horizontal and in line with the flybar cage, and obviously the same the other side, like so. And the gap that I ended up here from the edge of the cage to the edge of the flybar was 48mm. Okay, so here we have our frame set, and this is as it comes in the kit, so it's already built up. And again, we've got to go through, remove all of these screws, put Loctite on them, and then reinstall them, just to be sure that they aren't going to come out or haven't been Loctited as part of the pre-build done at the factory. Once we've done that, we can move on to the next build step. Okay, and our next build step is in fact the fitting of the main gear. Now this comes pre-installed with the one-way bearing, and then in bag 4-1 you'll find a little tiny washer which actually sits on top of the main gear, between the main gear and the lower main shaft bearing. And then there are these two locking collars as well. One of these goes underneath the main gear, and the other one is your usual locking collar, which goes above the top bearing block in the frames, and those effectively lock your main shaft in place so it can't move vertically. Now obviously, to complete this build step, we also have to use our pre-built rotor head, because that's actually got the main shaft already installed within it. So we're going to have to insert this down through the frames, through the main gear, and also through our shaft collars, and then we can lock it all into place with the supplied screws. Something I just forgot to mention about this little collar is, if you look at it closely, one side has got like a little raised lip on it, and the other side you'll find doesn't have that lip at all. And basically you want to mount these so the raised lip on the top one is against our top bearing block, so the raised lip will sit against the bearing here, and then on the bottom one the raised lip will sit against the bottom of our main gear, against there, so the raised lip will be up against the bottom of the main gear, against there. Okay, so there we have our upper collar installed, and there's a grub screw either side of this. So if I just spin it over, you can see there's a grub screw the other side, and there is a flat on the shaft either side as well, up here where this collar is, that those grub screws are locating into to hold that in place. So basically just install that collar right on where those flats are, with the grub screw each side locating onto the flat, Loctite them in place and tighten it up. And that's the top collar done. And then at this point you're in a position to insert this down through the top of the frames and through our main gear with the little washer on the top, and then on the bottom end of the main shaft we can put that last collar. So I'm not going to try and show that on camera because it's all too complicated. I'll put it all together and then you can have a look. Well, an interesting discovery in trying to install the main gear is that what you find is it actually won't go through the gap in the frames there to install. So the only way that you can actually get the main gear in is to take one side here of the bottom side frame off, then install the gear, and then put the bottom side of the side frame back on again. Okay, so there you see the main gear now kind of floating inside the frames, and as you can see you can't actually remove it from the frames once it's in, which is a slightly odd decision to make, being that a main gear is something that you might expect to strip teeth on occasionally, particularly in a crash, and you have to take off a bottom side frame in order to get it out. However, the servos are all housed in the upper frame, so it's not going to cause that much of a problem with electronics and that kind of stuff. But yeah, interesting. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is put the washer on the top of the gear here, and then we can insert our main mast and rotor head down through that, and we need to put the other collar in the little gap there between the third bearing block and the main gear, and it will use grub screws to lock it onto the bottom of the main mast. And you can see on the bottom of the main mast we have those flats that little collar is going to have grub screws through to locate into. As I said earlier, that's going to be a little bit of a fiddly operation, so I'm going to do that off camera. Okay, and there you see the main gear installed. We can see our collar at the bottom here between the third bearing block and the main gear, and the grub screws are screwed onto the flattened shaft there. And you get the main shaft goes through the main gear, then the little washer on the top in there, and it comes up to our top collar shaft. And again, this is pinched onto the flats on the main shaft and Loctited. And the effect of all that is that you've got no vertical play. So I'm just pulling on the rotor head here. No vertical play in the shaft, and the gear is free to spin one way and drive the other on the one-way bearing. You can see it will spin freely back anti-clockwise and drives clockwise as you would expect. Okay, so that's our main gear installed. The next thing we can put onto here is our anti-rotation slider, which is also in bag 4-1. I have that here, and it just has two little screws which hold it in place, and it actually screws onto this bracket here. Sorry, at the back here. It screws into the back here, into these. Oh, let's just move that rod out of the way. So if we're looking at our frames, here's the front where our servos will go, here's the back, and you can see there's a hole here and here, and that's where the anti-rotation slider bolts into. It goes on there like so, and the two screws go through it to hold it in place. Okay, having tried to fit my anti-rotation slider, the supplied screws in bag 4-1 are actually too small for the holes that are in the top of the bearing block here. So I'm going to continue on and see if I end up with some screws left over that will actually fit those holes. But for the moment there's an issue here in that those screws, they just fall right through the holes. They're too small altogether. So I will come back to this later in the build. So our next build step is bag 6, which is the undercarriage, and all this contains is our one-piece undercarriage and the screws and rubbers for mounting it onto the underside of our carbon frames. Okay, and there we have our undercarriage installed. Something to mention about this is that it's quite hard to get this to push onto the frames. Don't be tempted to try and separate the tabs here that go either side of the frames. Just persevere, pull it around a bit, and it should eventually pop on. And then you just put these self-tapping screws into holes. So the rubbers that go on the skids here, the ones on the back are pretty easy. The ones that go on the front, it looks like they're just far too small to go over the front of the skids, but actually they stretch pretty good, and they went on quite easily. So just put them on there and give them a pull, and they should go onto the skids no problem at all. And that's the undercarriage installed.